is a nation of people who have been dispossessed, had been forcibly removed, had economies built on the backs of the people and their natural resources in our history.
Let's start from the beginning. Before Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas, the Americas was inhabited by Native Americans. Ever since our understanding of the history of North America has expanded, it has become harder to find an exact time to mark when the first humans arrived, but we know it was at least 20,000 years ago. Having habituated the continent for so long, the Native Americans were a key to the first colonists' survival in a land they were not fond of. Chief Wahunsenakau was the leader of the tribes where the colonists landed at the time, the Chesapeake area, and decided to help the English colonists by acclimating them to America, and relations between the two groups were good. As the demands of both groups due to trade, food, and land increased, some conflicts arose, but it wasn't until John Smith left for England that the relationship between the colonists and native people fell apart, because the English started to steal their food and commit massacres. Similar situations began along the east coast of America as more English people started creating colonies in North America and treating Native Americans similarly. The Puritans realized that the more equal way of life of the Native Americans, especially for the women, could be appealing to some settlers, so rules and punishments were put into place to stop people from interacting with the Native Americans, and propaganda about them was spread through literature. Massacres began to happen, and the Native Americans were mostly largely outnumbered compared to the English. To try to mend these conflicts, many treaties and laws were created, but the U.S. violated mostly all of the treaties. Two of them being the Indian Removal Act and the Treaty of New Echota, in which the U.S. made many false claims, breaking the trust and diplomacy between the Cherokee people and Americans, creating conflict and further debate. Now, to start understanding the relationship between the Cherokee people and America, we can start talking about the 1832 Supreme Court decision of Worcester versus Georgia, making a groundbreaking decision. At a time where the Cherokee people were demanded to leave the fertile and resourceful land by white Americans backed up by governments believing in the manifest destiny, the Supreme Court decision gave the Cherokee people hope. It said that the Cherokee Nation could govern themselves, have their own sovereignty, and own their own land. However, Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, had no intention to execute and enforce the decision. Despite the Supreme Court decision, white settlers continued to do lawless acts, robbing, raping, and mistreating the Cherokee people. Majority of the Cherokee people wanted to stay in the cherished land that was very valuable to them. However, the Ridges, a wealthy and respectable household in the Cherokee tribe, began questioning whether to stay in the racist South, where they were not being considered sovereign despite the Supreme Court ruling, or move to the West, where they could actually govern themselves. Behind the back of Chief Ross, the chief of the Cherokee tribe at the time, Major Ridge and his son John Ridge decided they wanted to move westward. They signed the Treaty of New Echota without having any authority to represent the Cherokee people. The treaty said that the Cherokee people will be given the land, which is now Oklahoma, and $5 million in exchange for their ancestral land, which is now parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. The Cherokee people were furious about this. They believed the treaty shouldn't be considered since Major Ridge had no authority or right to sign a treaty on their behalf, and they voted to reject the treaty. Chief Ross submitted petitions supported by thousands of Cherokee people, nearly all of them. But on March 1, 1836, the Senate still ratified the fraudulent treaty, which was then, by no surprise, signed into law by Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act, which was previously enacted in 1830, had required that the government should negotiate treaties about removal with Native Americans peacefully, with their permission, and no one, including the president, was allowed to force Native Americans out of their land. However, Andrew Jackson still issued a forceful removal, and the Army General at the time, General John Bull, tried his best to delay the removal of the Indians, but because of this, he was replaced by General Winfield Scott. Since only about 2,000 Cherokee citizens had left Georgia at the time, in the summer of 1838, General Scott began to invade the Cherokee Nation with an army of 7,000 troops. The Cherokee were forced into stockades while General Scott and the troops robbed their homes. After looting the Cherokee people and evicting them from their homes, they were forced to walk on the Trail of Tears, which would become 1,200 miles of treacherous journey to what was promised Indian territory. It is estimated that 10 to 25% of the Cherokee, about 5,000 people, died on this trail. About 68 years later, America began to make land allotments in the Native Americans' homes in Oklahoma, splitting the land up to assimilate the tribes and open it to white settlers. Kids were forced to go to American Indian boarding schools to further assimilate them into American culture, and the effect of these events are shown in the relationship between American citizens and Native Americans today. Not only is the police more likely to kill Native Americans than any other racial group, but Native Americans' representation in the government is scarce, and not many people are properly educated and taught about Native Americans and their culture. Bringing more awareness into our classrooms and the media is a first step everyone should be willing to make, because the America we know wouldn't be this way if it wasn't for the Native people of this land. Thank you for listening.
Is a nation of people who have been dispossessed, had been forcibly removed, had economies built on the backs of the people and their natural resources in our history. And that is a history that the peoples represented here share. That is the history of the Lakota and the Dakota people. That is the history of great Indian nations all over this country. That is the history of indigenous peoples all over this world.